All right, let's dive in. Today, we're unpacking a huge vote in the EU that's causing a lot of waves. Our source for this explainer is a video from commentator Dr. Steve Turley, and he calls this a truly historic moment for immigration policy. So we're going to break down exactly why he thinks this is such a massive shift for Europe. Let's get right to it.
So, right out of the gate, our source doesn't pull any punches. He kicks things off by claiming something historic just went down in Brussels. This really sets the tone, you know? He's telling us this isn't just another day at the office for politicians, it's a fundamental change.
So what was this historic event? Well, it all comes down to a vote. On March 26, the European Parliament approved a brand new set of rules. The source calls it a sweeping new legal framework that's designed to completely overhaul how deportations are handled across the entire EU.
Okay, let's dig into the details of this vote. The policy itself is officially called the Returns Regulation, and according to our source, this wasn't just some minor policy tweak. This was a really decisive moment for the EU Parliament.
Now look at these numbers, because this is where it gets really interesting. This vote wasn't even close. We're talking 389 votes in favor and only 26 against. The source really emphasizes this point. It was a crushing victory. This wasn't a squeaker, it was a clear, overwhelming mandate from the Parliament.
So you might be asking, who made this happen? Well, the source points to what it describes as a unified right-wing bloc, something it claims would have been unthinkable not too long ago. The argument is that this coalition stretched from the traditional center-right all the way to populist and nationalist groups, and they all came together to push this through.
Now, to really understand why this new policy is such a big deal, we have to look at what it's replacing. The source spends a lot of time arguing that the old system was just completely, fundamentally broken, and that's what created the pressure for such a dramatic change.
And this is absolutely central to the source's argument. He claims that under the old rules, only 1 out of every 5 migrants who is officially ordered to leave the EU actually left. Just think about that for a second. That single statistic is used to argue that the whole enforcement system had basically collapsed.
This chart just paints the picture perfectly, doesn't it? For every 5 people given a deportation order, 4 of them stayed in the EU anyway. The source contends that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic failure, where official orders had become, largely symbolic.
In fact, the source has a name for this old system: managed chaos. The argument here is that the failure wasn't an accident. It was the result of a deliberately complicated system, a labyrinth of appeals, delays, and protections that was basically designed to make actually deporting anyone next to impossible. Okay, so that was the old way. How exactly does this new returns regulation plan to fix it? Well, according to the source, it's built on 4 major pillars that are meant to completely change the game.
Let's walk through them. First, the procedures get way stricter, with real penalties if you don't comply. Second, it allows for extended detention, up to 24 months, for anyone considered a security risk. Third, and the source highlights this as a huge one, is the plan to create return hubs outside the EU to process people. And finally, number 4, if you get deported as a security threat, you're facing a permanent ban, no coming back.
And this is where the source makes a really provocative comparison. He points out that many of the exact same political figures in Brussels had loudly and publicly condemned the UK's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, calling it barbaric.
And then he drops the punchline: those very same institutions have now voted to approve a framework that allows for very similar offshore processing hubs. In his view, they just made it standard EU policy. The source is really highlighting what he sees as a massive hypocrisy here.
So this is bigger than just one law. The source argues that this vote is a sign of a much deeper political transformation that's been happening all across Europe. It's not just about a single policy, it's about what has suddenly become politically possible.
To explain this, he brings up a political science concept called the Overton Window. Basically, it's the range of ideas that the public finds acceptable to even talk about. And the core argument from our source is that this window in Europe has shifted. And it shifted dramatically.
And this slide really visualizes that argument. The source claims that policies like mass deportations, which used to be dismissed by critics as far-right, are now being passed as mainstream EU policy, just under a different name, like border security. The whole political conversation, he argues, has moved. And as proof of this bigger trend, the source points to all these actions happening at the national level. Things like Germany planning to repatriate refugees, or bans on burqas and minarets in places like Switzerland, France, and Portugal. He frames all of these as individual pieces of a much larger puzzle,
a kind of continent-wide populist pushback that set the stage for this big EU vote.
So, after all that, what's the ultimate conclusion from our source? Well, he frames this vote as something much more profound than just a piece of legislation. It's about the identity and the very future of the continent.
The final takeaway is that this is really the political result of a much deeper cultural shift. He actually calls it a civilizational awakening. The idea is that ordinary citizens felt their way of life was threatened, so they kept using the ballot box over and over again until their leaders had no choice but to act.
And finally, he brings it all home for his American audience. He says, hey, if you're watching this from the US, don't just think of this as some distant European drama. He argues that it's a direct preview of the exact same political fights that are already happening stateside.
And so we end with the big question that the source himself poses. Is this vote in Brussels just an isolated event, something unique to Europe? Or does it signal a broader, global shift in how Western nations are starting to think about immigration and national identity? It's a pretty provocative thought to end on.